The Prohibition and the Mafia by Max Fiorello.
Someday, and that day may never come, I'll call upon you to do a service for me. But until that day, accept this justice as a gift on my daughter's wedding day.
Grazie. Grazie, padre.
Great.
My thesis is that if Prohibition had not been enacted in America, the Mafia would not have moved their operations here, and less lives would have been lost from drug abuse and murder. Before Prohibition was enacted, the Industrial Revolution had almost stopped, and a dawn of a new age was arising. People could get around easier, produce products easier, and many other things that would have been tiring and laborious were now easy and efficient. Alcohol was a cheaply made product that now could be produced by the masses and had many uses that expanded from beverages all the way to medicines. There were some people that were opposed to alcohol. They had power and they had a large strength in numbers. This group was called the American Temperance Union, and they had been dedicated to their goal of illegalizing alcohol for the last 70 years. One of the members of the American Temperance Union was named Carrie Nation. Carrie Nation was an extreme activist who would carry around a hatchet and would destroy barrels of alcohol with it. Being before the Prohibition, this was illegal. There are a few reasons why people started to listen to the American Temperance Union. First off, it was World War I, and America had just entered the war. Since America had never entered a war of such a magnitude, people were afraid that the American soldiers would use alcohol too much and would affect their performance on the battlefield. Secondly, America was using a substantial amount of grain for alcohol production, and it was affecting the production of other wheat items. Alcohol, being not as important as other grain products, was shunned and was ridiculed. Lastly, America's enemy, Germany, was a large producer of alcohol sold in America and was put on a trade embargo. Since a large amount of alcohol trades had been stopped, the choice of prohibiting it was pushed over the edge and then was enacted. After the Prohibition was enacted, the Cosa Nostra, more commonly known as the Mafia, saw a new form of revenue coming along and jumped on the illegal alcohol bandwagon. The Mafia became interested in America because it took an easy-to-make, cheap product and doubled its value. At the time, the black market became mostly alcohol. With the Mafia being in America, the homicide and narcotic abuse rates started to rise. The once underground dealings of illegal substances and acts started to become mainstream, and with a new form of business came new, fresh people for the job. The Americans that had thought that Prohibition was a good idea started to see an overencumbering downside of Prohibition. Plus, most of Americans from the beginning had thought that prohibiting alcohol was a bad idea. The most famous gangster of all time, Al Capone, who has killed 4 people himself and has ordered dozens of hits, became famous because of the Prohibition. Al Capone was born in Brooklyn to Teresina and Alfonso Capone. He had 9 other brothers and sisters that lived poorly since their father was a barber. At the age of 14, Al Capone was kicked out of school and never went back again. This is because he hit a nun after she had slapped him. Even though he was a good student, he never went back to school and chose instead to join a small street gang. When Al Capone was in his 20s, after a night of drinking, he started to harass a woman at a nightclub, but was stopped by her brother and was given a scar on his left cheek, giving him the nickname Scarface. When Prohibition came along, Capone met a man named John Torrio. Immediately after meeting each other, they became the best of friends and thought of the idea to go down to Chicago and start an alcohol producing and smuggling business. When they went down to Chicago, Torrio introduced Capone to a man named George Moran. Capone became the apprentice to Moran and learned all of his selling strategies from him. The three men became the largest alcohol selling and producing gang in America. Then the streets of Chicago were now owned by them, and everyone, including the police, tried not to get involved with their activities. When the gang got large enough, they chose to go their separate ways and make their own bootlegging businesses. Since they had split up, they became each other's competition, and that meant war would have to begin. Al Capone's first target was John Torrio, a person that had been his friend for years. In an assassination attempt on Torrio's life by Al Capone, Torrio was the first person to be knocked out of the quote-unquote business. Capone's next victim was Bugs Moran, Al Capone's teacher and mentor. An all-out gang war erupted between Capone and Moran, and many lives were lost in shootouts between them. The war ended abruptly with a massacre that is and will always be remembered as the most gruesome mafia killing in existence. This bloody murder of 7 people is called the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. It all started when Capone met with Machine Gun Jack McGurn to speak of how they were going to take down Moran. The plan was that 2 of Capone's men would go into Moran's hideout, dressed as police officers, and then they would pretend they were raiding the place. Then, Capone's men would line up Moran's men and then would take all of their weapons. After lining them up, Capone's men would quietly call in 2 other gang members armed with Thompson machine guns, and they themselves would pull out double-barreled shotguns. In cold blood, Capone's men would unload all of their ammunition into the men lined against the wall, and then they would pretend like they were arresting the 2 men who walked in with machine guns. This is a recreation of the brutal murder that is the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. The plan went down in 1929 on Valentine's Day, or February 14th. It shocked the nation and was the top story on all forms of media for the next 2 months. There was only one survivor of the St. Valentine's Massacre, and he was found with 14 bullet wounds in his body. The only survivor of the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, Pete Goosenberg, when asked who had shot him and killed his gang, said, "Nobody shot me," to the police officer. Minutes later, Goosenberg died from a heart failure and loss of blood. Goosenberg did not say who shot him because of the Mafia's code of silence that states you shall not divulge information to the police. In Italian, this code is called omerta. After the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, which Moran had survived because he was not there when it had happened, his gang started to split up because they were afraid that they would be murdered by Al Capone. Since there was no more Moran and Torrio gang, Al Capone was now the leader of Chicago's crime ring. Even though Moran was out of the game, he still would cause trouble for Capone with a few people who still worked for him and had not been scared away. On February 15th, 1936, Machine Gun Jack McGurn was found dead in a bowling alley with a Valentine sent for him in the lobby. Machine Gun Jack McGurn's brainchild was the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, and he was one of Capone's most valuable men. Because of this, historians believe that the murder of Machine Gun Jack McGurn was done by one of Capone's goons. Moran's goons, I am sorry. Bugs Moran went on the FBI Most Wanted list after the murder of Jack McGurn and was arrested in 1937. He died 40 days later from cancer. Going back to Al Capone, after the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, Capone also went to jail, but instead of for murder, he went to jail for tax evasion since there was no real proof of his involvement with the St. Valentine's Day Massacre until now. I'm sorry, this video takes a long time to load.
Facing trial on income tax evasion, Al Capone finds an aroused government ready to put him behind bars. Overlord of every type of vice, the man who rose to power during Prohibition leaves federal court a convicted felon.
Capone spent 6 years in Alcatraz and started to see symptoms of syphilis. He had gotten syphilis back in Chicago when he was working with small-time gangs and worked in a brothel for a while. When Capone got out of prison, he went to Palm Island in the Caribbean, where he spent the rest of his life. He died in 1947. From the Prohibition came such violence as the Capone Wars and the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. Over 10,000 people died from alcohol poisoning from moonshine made from wood alcohol during the Prohibition, and moonshine was largely sold by the Mafia. People lost trust in their government and felt like it was incapable of catching criminals. Prohibition was an experiment to see if America could function properly without alcohol. When the experiment failed, America did not just clean up the lab and go back to normal. The Mafia became a huge deal in society and changed history for the worse through drug trades, prostitution, gambling, and other illegal activities. In relation to current events, Prohibition and its crime kings relate to the illegal drugs being smuggled over the border and the thousands of lives taken by cartels. This makes you think that maybe America would just do better with drugs being legal. I conclude that if Prohibition had not happened, the 1920s would not have been infamous for crime. Thousands of lives would have been saved from consumption of unsafe, homemade alcohol, and lastly, the Mafia would not have come to America to stay. This has been a Max Fiorello presentation. Fiend. Works cited.